Another state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the...
Welcome to the Black Myth Podcast. Welcome to the Black Myth Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. This is part 2 of our discussion on the myth that redlining originated in the U.S. So we've been discussing this with Dr. Rasul Mowatt, who recently just put out a book, The Geographies of Threat and the Production of Violence, the state and the city between us. So we've been discussing primarily really just one chapter out of this book. It's a pretty thorough book. So this is part 2, continuing with what we've already been discussing in regards to maps and how map making has a particular colonial and an imperial logic to it, at least within the Western world, and how that shapes the ways that our cities are made and the places that we live. And so by redlining is not anything exceptional. It comes out of a larger history. Redlining is not anything special. It comes out of a larger history of designating where populations will live based on the benefits of capital in the state. So gonna get to it. Rasul just picks up right where he left off. If you haven't heard part 1, I would definitely recommend you listen to it to give you more context for this one. But we pick up right where he left off. We're talking about how botany informed the idea, at least within Spanish colonies, within the Spanish Empire, about how to organize populations based off race. Like botany was actually a logic for that. So we're continuing that, and we're going to get into more discussions on so-called gentrification and flipping of homes and just what city planning really looks like more so in the modern era. So tune in. And also real quick, if you could, as we say at the beginning of every episode, support our Patreon. We're going to start shouting out people who sign up. It takes a lot of work to make sure we read these books and have the research prepared, whether we're discussing with an author or whether we're breaking it down ourselves. And leave a review if you could. All right, so let's get to the discussion.
And so we also see earlier forms of media portrayals of populations, right? In 1510, 1520, like they are saying in mediated sort of avenues. So whatever the forms of news, saying that we need to deal with these dangerous mixtures of people. And so, yes, so the four types of concentration is, I already went over congregation and segregation. The next two is enclosures and then the collection. So enclosures are what Nimsher sort of frames as the prison and the schools. So things in which populations are sort of regulated to for certain types of labor extraction or whatever else. So we think of, like, in feudal times, the farm area is an enclosure. Right. So once the land was seized by the crown, that was no longer the ownership of the farmer. It was now the ownership of the crown. And now the farmer had to work that area, and they couldn't work in other areas. That's an enclosure. Right. But in this regards, the prison is the enclosure and the school. And in both of these places, it was about disciplining the population, correcting their behavior. And so through forms of education. So prison educates you in one way, and schools educate you in another way, but technically both of those ways are the same way for the same purposes, and so this is before even the school, pipeline to prison, things we talk about now with schools, right? Like, this is happening in colonial Mexico City, 1500. We still haven't even gotten out of the 1600s yet, right? In Mexico City. And we're seeing the practices that are present still today. And then the fourth type of concentration that Nimsher says is collection. Now he says he's not talking about people at this particular point, but Spain invested so much money in the botanical gardens all throughout Mexico City. And so botanist becomes an important field of study, and people were able to travel down and study the plants that were being grown in Mexico, because of course the plants that could be grown in Mexico, there was a greater variety than in Spain. And so people would come and study them, figure out which plants could grow in what type of climate and how much water, and which ones can be spliced to produce whatever else. And so Nemser makes the point that collection becomes this important foundation of how to think about framing populations, because we know Carl Linnaeus in 1700s, late 1700s, is a botanist. And Carl Linnaeus is the first person that comes up with a scientific explanation of race.
Right.
So he's coming out of probably years upon years from these Spain-based botanical gardens that were the collection. And maybe some of his professors were, Spaniards, right? And so on. But the field itself had been influenced by these years of the productions of these elaborate gardens. And these gardens still exist today. Like, you can still go to Mexico City and see these gardens from 1520, 1540, and so forth. So Nemser says that these are the four types of concentration. Now, Nemser doesn't talk about the modern day period, but I think Nemser's, point is incredible. And I wanted to try to figure out how to sort of bring that reality to the present, because it's all there. Just that foundation of the grids, alongside how to then use these grids to fix populations. And so Nemser makes the argument that I also want to sort of say here, is that you have to first classify a population or fix a population under some type of identity that then can be filled in. So calling a population Indian or African then granted Spain the ability to then now begin to ascribe different things onto that population, because the African, the Indian didn't call themselves that. They called themselves whatever they saw themselves as in their own in perspective. But once it's now that those Africans, those Indians, now you can sort of do whatever with them, right? And then later you can begin to sort of apply other characteristics and so on. But so Nemser makes the argument just simply labeling them, that was the beginning standpoint. And I would then say, because of my reading of Nemser, is that race is not socially constructed. It's spatially produced. So if you didn't have neighborhood areas that you clustered that population in, once you fix people in this space, and then you begin to label that space in a certain way, those people then are associated with the space. And so if you don't have that, if you don't place them in that space, none of this works.
Right.
So, Spain is the first to come up with this elaborate casta, casta, which is caste system, with 132 different sort of groupings of people. Well, even though they came up with that, people weren't respecting it. No one stayed in their caste. People were socializing across castes. They were employing people across castes.
It's not natural to just do that.
No, and people are not going to just follow it just because you said that's what we're supposed to follow. So
you had to have some enforcement strategy.
Yeah. I mean, the Dutch ran into that as well in parts of Asia that they ran. That they came up with these, caste system, and people didn't listen to that. And so now physically fixing them into a pocket area, that begins the process of actual race.
So you're saying, you said spatially construct. I just want to get the term right. You said spatially constructed.
Yeah, spatially constructed or spatially produced. But I say
so when you say, just for people, because I think even with the whole race is socially constructed, I don't even know I mean, I know what it means. So I'm saying I don't know what it means and how it gets talked about broadly anymore. Race isn't real, it's socially constructed, and people don't. It kind of becomes an abstract. So what is socially constructed versus spatially, just so people can like see the distinctions that you're drawing, or even the similarities in some cases. Like, what's the difference?
Yeah. Good question. So when people hear social construction, they think you and I, Terrell, we just collectively came together and just said, we're gonna call ourselves, the caramel collection, or or the chocolate swirls, or whatever, and so or whatever else. But the whole idea, that's what people think is somehow social construction is just people sort of naming themselves or whatever, and if we just sort of like break away from how we name ourselves, we can sort of correct these issues. But that's not what social construction was created, or labeled as by Du Bois. He meant that it's politically, created to determine the social relationships between people. Where are people in their occupation, in their education, and so on. That's what Du Bois meant when he created the idea that race is a social construction.
That's not normally how people even. That's not how it gets talked about anymore.
Not at all. It's more
same thing for all the other identity categories. But that's another episode. So I don't want to drag that on. But go ahead.
Yeah. So again, people think of social construction as if like let's defy the census and not check out whatever box. Like, no, that's not social construction whatsoever. Social construction is the fact that if you live in a certain neighborhood, you most likely are going to be killed. But I'm making the argument that maybe even Du Bois did not see it completely. And I'm arguing, because of my reading of Nimtzer, doing all of this incredible archival work of Mexico City, old Mexico City. I want to keep sort of reminding people that we're talking, late 1400s, all throughout the 1500s, and I'm saying that race can only be spatially produced, because if you don't have any spatial arrangement in which people have to physically live in a certain area in a greater number, the whole thing of what we perceive of populations won't work. People will defy that, arrangement. And people have throughout history when, you did not separate populations, with any distinctive lines. You see this. So Spain responds to the dangerous mixture of Indios, Creole, and Mestizos and Negros. And they said that the Indios, the indigenous populations, were the instigators, right, of the riot. And they controlled the city for 2 days, right? And so they wanted to break that possibility of them ever communicating and being around each other again. And so they created Barrios. So literally the term Barrios comes from colonial Mexico, and the Barrios were the explicitly identified neighborhoods of these sort of categories of people. Now, these categories weren't fixed. Sometimes Negros and Indios were interchangeable for the population. So sometimes enslaved Africans were called Indios, and sometimes indigenous populations to Latin America were called Negros. They didn't care because they just weren't Spanish, right? So, they didn't, they were, but basically that comes from that time period. So I'm saying that by fixing people into those neighborhoods, you now not only prevent people from interacting with each other politically, but also it's more easy to ascribe the myths that you want to place onto a population, because you can't say somebody's criminal, but you can label an area criminal, and if you live in that area, then you're a criminal.
Or even if you look like someone from that area, even if you don't live there,
right?
So I mean, because the only way you can ascribe a stereotype is as a collective. Like, you can't say Terrell is a stereotype of Terrell, but so you have to say like he's a stereotype of some bigger community. That's the only way you can even ascribe that onto an individual, let alone a group. That's the only way I would say you could even justify the action is if you belong to this group that we have crafted an identity around. But that group has to be, like you said, that group does have to be somewhere. So that is an interesting way of thinking about it. Like if it was just an idea and they didn't exist anywhere, like collectively, then it is a question of how important would race be. And I even think about this having grown up in a smaller town, even though it's segregated, it just, everybody had to go to school together because it's just not a big town. So you can't like split us up as much. So race is different in like smaller towns. Even under this current construction of things, it plays out differently than it will in a city like Indianapolis or Chicago, where people are hyper segregated and you don't even see white people for maybe a whole month, versus in a city like Muncie, where I'm originally from, like you're gonna see them every day. So race is still a thing, but even then, a lot of times we're ascribing the ideas we have about people in bigger cities to people in smaller cities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of a hood is a physical location with all these characteristics, and
right.
And we already know what people are associated with the hood. You don't call every neighborhood a hood,
no.
Right? And so yeah, I mean, and even what we were talking about earlier with a ghetto, right? So, but that goes back to 1516, right? So a ghetto had all these ascriptions that the Venetians called these Jews. So the idea, again, I think for me, without space, the whole thing would crumble, right? Because without that space, people are going to interact with each other at work and in their housing unit or their neighborhood area, and whatever the decree is, that's not going to make a difference in the day-to-day thing. It's like, I'm going to go next door and ask you if you can help me, put in my spare tire, on my car, because I need some help, right? Like, regardless of what's being said, you're just going to interact with each other on a whole different way. So again, I know that's a pretty big tangent from where we were going in terms of the 1800s going back. But Nimser's concentration points and looking at those and just seeing like how he's talking about this time period and realizing like none of this stuff is new. None of this, segregated neighborhoods, bad media portrayals, prisons.
Just remixed a little better.
What you say?
It's just remixed.
Exactly.
Yeah, they improved it. I guess it's like thinking about, I think going back helped because we were talking mainly about maps, but I think the concentration of populations in different ways, I think that's an important way to think about it in relationship to what, once you draw the map, like basically this is what happens. so it's like,
I hope you all, as well as the audience, sort of realizes like how now redlining maps, and redlining itself is probably so irrelevant, now, because again, we haven't even gotten to the 20th century yet, much less, or we've only mentioned maybe 1901, 1903.
Right.
And it's already been all of these elaborate maps that have been designed to segregate populations, to classify populations, to extract taxes and other things from populations already, right? Already, and there's so many others. I mean, so when we start thinking about crime maps, so the vice maps of San Francisco, made by the commission, I think it was San Francisco Board of Supervisors, they create this vice map of San Francisco, primarily because of moral panic around the Chinese populations, because the Chinese were the sort of scapegoats for gambling and so on. And the vice maps of Chinatown would show which houses were the places for gambling, for prostitution, for opium, and for white prostitution. So so they had two different types of prostitutions, there. And these maps were in the 1800s. But what else is also going on in San Francisco in the 1800s? 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act it gets passed as a federal law that prevents Chinese. So there's this massive anti-Chinese sentiment that, yes, is on the West Coast, but becomes a completely federal law throughout the entire country, which prevents anybody Chinese from entering the country, even if they are Chinese citizens. If the law passed and they were in China at that time, they could not come back at all. And that was the case for a lot of families, that because Chinese population had already been, and by the 1880s had already been in places like San Francisco for 4 generations. They were brought in, they were attracted to come in for, because of overpopulation and poverty in China for job opportunities. And so they were put to work on the railroads and, all throughout the West. But yeah, no, I mean, the crime maps, the vice maps of San Francisco, if people look at them, are color coded. Each color is sort of indicating which house is for gambling, which house is for general prostitution, which house is for opium, and which house is for white prostitution. I think they also have houses called Joss houses, and that was like just some really sort of disrespectful way to sort of classify various sort of religions and spiritual systems that Chinese populations were practicing. The places in which they would come and sort of practice those things. So, but that's 1880s. And then also in 1890s, Florence Kelley is commissioned by the U.S. Department of Labor to do nationality maps in different cities. And in most cases, in most cities, the classification was up to 18 different nationalities. And the maps would show clustering of those nationalities in the cities, where the Italians, where the Armenians, and so forth live throughout the city. 1895. Robert Wood maps, 1903, is a map called The Distribution of Predominant Race Factors in West End of Boston. So the Florence Kelley maps influenced in other maps around this question of mapping nationality and ethnicity. So if we're seeing the trend of what's growing, poverty mapping, turns into, crime concern mapping, right? That then turns into, ethnicity, race-based mapping of a city. And so then we get to then the Sanborn map company, which is, it was for insurance, fire insurance. And it sort of classified the quality of homes and which homes were of greatest hazards for fires. And this, of course, this is a concern. I mean, I'm from Chicago, and so we know the history of the Chicago fire, right? That destroyed most of the city, right? And so these types of insurance-based maps, because of fire, were important. But I would argue, I think Sanborn maps are probably the immediate sort of parent of the redlining maps, because of their focus or emphasis on insurance.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
And so, and so Sanborn, is in another profession, and his maps become so important that he starts to get commissioned or contracted by other companies. And the first company he's contracted is Aetna Insurance Company in 1866. 1866, Aetna, right? So, insurance companies that have commercials or whatever else in the present day or whatever else, they existed, all the way back to this time. And he was doing it for like Tennessee as a state, and then different places in Boston the following year. And then he began to pick up so much that he devoted full-time the company towards map making. And so it becomes a larger, organization. It sets up a bureau center in New York City. And by 1902, it becomes, a sort of full-fledged just map company. And ironically, Warren Buffett is some way, not an intern, but works in some capacity in relationship to this company, and expresses some some ideas that aren't really listened to, and he purchases large amounts of shares of this company in the 1960s, and this is primarily how he starts his wealth. You know. But the Sanborn maps are all around insurance, and it would color code in different parts of the city, which areas of the city have the most sort of hazardous homes for fire coding. And so that's in terms of cities. If we think about the globe and worldwide, there's a whole sort of range of other maps become important, but I don't want to go into the world since we still have yet to say redlining at all. But again, I mean, it's not just the Spanish Empire. I said that the British, other people imitated this sort of pattern. So we can look in 1700s, the British were doing the same thing in terms of designing the look of the city and where was things at, as early as 1600s in India, right? So when we look at maps of cities like Madras, they would label a location White Town and Black Town because the British East India Company was located there. They set up a port city that grew because they were extracting resources from India, right? And they brought people in, so congregation brought people in and situated them in a Black Town area. And that was where all of the non-British were living in, not non-white, non-British. Yeah, and then White Town was where all the British of various classes would live. And we can already imagine what were the conditions in Black Town and what were the conditions in White Town.
Right.
And then this is imitated in other cities under the control, like in Calcutta in 1823, we see Black towns being sort of listed. And you can go to India, to these cities to this day, and there's tours of Black Town and so on. But Black Town, right? We're talking about India, right? So
Right.
Yeah.
And then also it's not just African people when we're talking about Black in that case. It's not British. So even if you're like Irish or Scottish, or you would fall under that, if that was even a
well the British and Irish that were under the control by this time of Britain would be in White Town just because they were employees of
okay.
But if somebody
that's why I was trying to figure out. I was like wait, because the years were there's a lot of years here, so I was
exactly. But this would be like if there were Eastern Europeans that happened to be there for work, they would be in Black Town. But yeah, Black Town had no African representation whatsoever. This is a completely Indian, East Indian population. So this idea of racial zoning, literally they call it racial zoning, becomes an aspect of British colonies. And then they repeat this in parts of Africa they begin to control as well. So to me, like, there are some key sort of maps that contribute to the present day, Hume, the Charles Booth maps, and then I'll make the argument that the Sanborn maps around insurance is probably the direct sort of probably contributor or producer of what's then conceived of as the redlining maps. But there's so many, man. I mean, there's another map in 1860 that's really good that, I'm sure you're going to show a lot of these particular maps. But in 1860, the National Temperance League, and so temperance is the society of, extremely religious populations that had a racial, ethnic sort of, ethno-racial viewpoint of drinking or alcohol, and they wanted abstinence of alcohol consumption. So they were very much anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-German in certain respects. And so they created maps to identify, drinking areas to sort of do better work on restricting drinking and public intoxication. And there's plague maps of cities that begin to like take shape in the late 1800s as well, because syphilis, typhus, cholera are like spreading like wildfire, all throughout the world. from like 1870 to like 1910. And so we then begin to see then in 1920s crime maps. And this is where I was, mentioning Terrell earlier. So 1927 delinquency area study of the 1927 is by Frederick Thrasher, and he's looking at different maps, and one map is called Gangland for Chicago. So he's literally, plotting the different gangs in 1927 all throughout Chicago. And another particular map is, or publication is The Gang, a study of 1,313 gangs in Chicago from the same time period of the 1920s. And on these maps, you see terms like wilderness, black spots, slums, colonies, territory being sort of distinctly applied to the phrasing for these maps alongside barriers, borders, and frontiers, areas. So yeah.
There's nothing, I mean, I know you got more, but it's like, there's nothing unique at this point, if you're still listening. There's nothing unique about redlining. I mean, it doesn't make it any less of a problem, but I'm just saying, like, as a practice, it sounds like, I mean, it's told to us as this discovery, as if it was like, oh my God, but like you said, it was like, this really sounds like this is how it works. Like there is no real, this isn't an anomaly of any sort. I mean, it's just like, it's a good illustration to show what happens, but it's not like all of this stuff you're talking about here and the different ways of labeling, like not just the coloring. Like that's actually just one part of it.
Yeah.
Like
if the three of us were, let's say, in middle school and we were going to lunch, and we're describing this as a plate of our food, redlining is nothing more than the packet of ketchup or mustard on that plate. All the other maps comprise the chocolate milk, the chicken fingers, the mashed potatoes with the cold gravy, and all that other stuff. Because and there's so many more maps. I mean, I always try to give a lot of, information in whatever context, because, some people are going to look for some things. And so that's great for people's curiosity and confirmation, because, people shouldn't have to be dependent upon what I say or just what's in my book. You can go look at this stuff on your own. But right. Yeah, once you start seeing this, like we haven't, once you get to 1933, so what about redlining,
Yeah.
I mean, you've already have framed these populations, clustered them, congregated them, concentrated them in certain ways, segregated them in all types of ways, and you've already mapped them in other ways.
So we're already there.
So this also helps us sort of separate, in my mind, that redlining has nothing to do with, some type of racial hatred, as much as it's about control of property, control of population and control of property. Because while we understand that these areas were, classified for, various levels of insurance or being able to get a loan, right? That, to me, I think it was setting up the ability that would later become gentrification, right? Or what we would call gentrification, because I don't like to use the term gentrification, but
he's pissing everybody off today.
but I would argue that redlining is actually the practice that helps to set up the ability to downgrade or lower the property values of an area, so that then you can seize on that property at lower amounts, and then you can flip those areas after you displace that population, because that's what we see what begins to happen after redlining. And I think that's what people miss, is that they concentrate so much on look redlining, look how racist people are in labeling these areas, and not seeing immediately after redlining you start to see displacement. Places, cities like St. Louis and Louisville come up with city plans that wholesale displace populations from these so-called bad, low insurance, low, low loan-based places to get that property and move them somewhere else. And once they get that property, they build whole new parts of the city.
And Keeanga Marty Taylor talks about in Race for Profit. Her book tracks like pretty much after the era that everybody likes to talk about. I hope I'm getting this story right, but she talks about in Philly. This is actually directly related to the government too. HUD was gonna provide all these like cheap down payments, like $200 down. They were gonna give all these homes to these to these so poor, I think it was poor Black mothers too that they were targeting at the time. And then the HUD was taking like bribes from like private realtors and something, and they just didn't fix up any of these homes. So they would just move the mothers in. These homes would have like rats, be completely dilapidated. They would just move, they would move their families out. Then they would appraise these homes at an extremely high rate so nobody could afford to live in them. And then they would sell them at an auction to all these real estate companies, and then they would just flip the homes. And it actually like really sped up gentrification in Philly. And this is in like, I believe she's in the 60s. I believe that's what she said. So like, I jumped to the 60s, but I'm just saying like, this is just, like flipping things and rolling it over into the next thing seemed to just be a logic of capitalism anyway. Right. Just across the board.
No, when St. Louis displaces 20,000 primarily Black residents of Mill Creek, that's not in 1930s, that's in 1950s. So Redlining had already established the areas of a city, but then also lowered the property value so that then when they kicked all these people out in 1 week, so 20,000 people in 1 week.
Yeah, that's
once they move
that's unfathomable. But
so once they displaced this entire population, they were able to sell all this land, to all of these different speculators and real estate brokers for a lower amount. And then they were able to, grow and flip that property over and over and over again to, present day. I'm sure if somebody buys a home in these areas, it could probably be $1 million home, right? And so to me, redlining had nothing to do with racist thinking, and so anti-racism doesn't work on this, right? Redlining is about getting property, and so the elements of crime, elements of all these things help to downgrade and lower property values, and lowering property values helps with enticing more people to buy that property. Once you get rid of the population that is present in that property.
So it just so happens that we happen to be there, or
because
race is a justification for it, right?
There we go. That's what I was looking. That's what I was looking for you to say. Race, yeah.
But race is a justification. It's not that race had nothing to do with it, right? It's just that it's not solely we hate these people so they can't have homes.
That's right.
That might be the logic of some people, but it's largely like we've already we've talked about. We've already put all these ideas and attached all of this stuff to these people. So It just makes sense to do, to just rinse and repeat.
So if you have a neighborhood area with potentially 20,000 criminals, because you've ascribed the myth of criminality onto this population, no one is going to balk at 20,000 people, having to leave an area because they've been downgraded in the mindset of most of the people in the city, right? If you didn't downgrade them in any particular way, people would kind of raise issue with, why you're doing this, to these people.
It's not you saying, we displaced 20,000 Black people. No, we moved 20,000 criminals and murderers, rapists, all that.
That's right.
Instead of just saying, hey, look, we taking these niggas and moving them over here, increase the property value. You guys buy it at the low cost. then sell it.
Yeah, because even like blockbusting was like that's what they did, right? They would like it was the other way around in a way. Like they would go blockbusting was we go and we scare the shit out of white people that black people are coming to their neighborhood, and then they'll sell their homes for cheap, and then we're gonna sell these homes to black people and charge them exorbitant rates of interest rates and contracting homes. Like that's all blockbusting was, So just,
like we said
before. Yeah, I mean, in most cases with blockbusting, it wasn't any of these black people even living there. They would just pay actors to look like they lived there. So drive down the street blasting your music, pay a couple of black women to push strollers with babies that may not even be their own baby, down the street. And, people were like, oh, we got to move, like just off of, that idea, and of course, this also cultivates the production of white enclaves like Levittown, so these sort of suburbs that begin to be produced throughout the country. Levittowns are only in 9 different cities, but Levittown-like cities are in other particular spaces, and they, in their early period of time, they distinctly sort of excluded all populations that weren't Caucasian, in their sort of rental agreement. So that overlaps with that same time period. So you block bus to get the property value in the city low, and you make this population flee to this other property that you're selling in the suburbs, right? So it was, the perfect setup. And I think
you're just moving people around, and money keeps circulating. And the people themselves who live in those neighborhoods might hate black people.
The dollar keeps circulating.
Say what?
The dollar keeps circulating.
What did I say?
Oh, you said the money keeps circulating. I was just cracking a joke about a dollar.
I'm not touching that. Yeah, the white dollar was circulating. For those who get it, they get it. If not, go watch the Black Wall Street. But yeah, I mean, when you think about like that, like that last point, like it all kind of comes together. Like they just move people from one place, and the rationalization might be in certain individual minds that black people are criminals. Like in that case, it might be racial hatred, but the people that are actually pulling the strings on this might hate black people, might not. I would argue it doesn't really matter because it's still gonna happen regardless, right? Like, and even the white folks who maybe who hate black people, even the individuals who live in these neighborhoods, they still know that their property value is going to go down if black people show up, or criminals or whatever. So, again, whether they hate niggas or not, it's still gonna happen. It's just part of the rationalization. So, yeah.
And I think the important point too is we have to see this, just as I was trying to do work around. So some of the stuff that I was mentioning is not in the book, right? Mm-hmm. But because a lot of it's like United States based, and the book is trying to talk about cities internationally to show that this is the same everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. We can sort of see this housing structure in Kyiv and the Ukraine or wherever else, right? But I think the important thing for us too, in terms of thinking about the United States, is it played out differently in different places. So going back to San Francisco, still to this day, the city would love to get rid of Chinatown, or at least more parts of Chinatown, because Chinatown is on prime property.
Real estate,
real estate, now the Chinese was able to inhabit there because, when early periods of San Francisco, there was undesirable, property, but, they remained in there. And even after earthquakes, like in 1903, the city wanted to seize that opportunity after the earthquake to get the land of Chinatown, and the Chinese government had to step in and sort of, hint at sort of armed conflict if these people who had property in San Francisco could not return back to their property.
I mean, the Chinese government protected their people, but sorry, I'm just making a joke, but as far as, because they're just so terrible, but they sound like having some type of homeland was helpful in that case.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's probably, I mean, they probably weren't thinking about the Chinese Americans. They were probably thinking about just the Chinese immigrants that were living there, you know, because we also think about early forms of embassy, you know, so probably in Chinatown was the only location that there was governmental sort of representation in the United States, you know, physically present. And since San Francisco is one of the oldest Chinatowns, I think it's important to mention, but they're still, I mean, they were eating at parts of Chinatown right up until the 1970s when they got rid of what's known as like this I Hotel, which was this sort of like low budget housing, you know, for Asian seniors, primarily Filipino men, and they wanted to, you know, demolish it, and so they had a planned eviction of this population in the 70s, and people had to come out and barricade, you know, themselves physically to prevent the police from going in and removing all the residents. Now the city won, but they, you know, and they moved all those people out and they got their property. But this is in the business district, so that's why they were trying to move those people out. They were trying to expand the space of the business district, which is now surrounding all of Chinatown. So again, they would love to eat away at more and more of Chinatown still to this present day, if they had the chance. So it plays out differently, but in a similar, for different populations, but in a similar way in different parts of the country, in terms of this question of redlining and so on. Because when we look at St. Louis, some of the redlining areas, yeah, clearly were Black, but also some of them were Russian. You know, so some of the Russian populations and so on were also in the redlining areas.
One thing I did want to ask about, it's not, I don't even think it's on my paper, but just, I don't know, I said at the beginning about how the way this gets framed locally, and then we can connect this, you know, beyond, or I should say nationally, but we can connect this internationally as well. But the way it gets framed is just like, okay, Black people lost out on their ability to build wealth. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be a concern or that's not an issue, depending on how you look at wealth in general. But so the argument is that we need to, or not, I'm not part of we, but America needs to, like, you know, distribute the wealth to Black people or give them home ownership. Like we've seen that be a response for whatever reason to George Floyd. You know, and that just doesn't, based on what we just kind of ran through these last few hours, that doesn't seem to really cut it. And it honestly doesn't seem realistic that the state is just going to be like, all right, y'all can just have wealth. You might have a certain class of Black people that get that. I could see that happening maybe, and that already has kind of happened in some ways, but it just seems like a very insufficient way of even talking about this at this point. I guess that's just how I feel about it. So I'm just curious how you see that, like, because that's the main way that people, that's the only reason, like I mentioned, Biden and Kamala Harris and all and the popular kind of like Black wealth building and Black capitalists, like there's like this convergence. Even when you talk to some socialist people about, well, Black people need wealth, and again, I'm not saying we don't, but it just seems very insufficient when you consider that this is a world system that's just moving people around, you know, for whatever profits that they can make. Like it just doesn't seem sufficient. Am I missing something or?
No. No, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, I'm not, you know, not trying to like talk bad about people, but I think it's pitiful for us, you know, when we sort of think about it in this context, but not in this particular, you know, not founded on anything. When we have this sort of viewpoint or a sense of all of this history, one, redlining becomes almost insignificant in the scheme of city management practices. But also we begin to see that it doesn't matter. I mean, like if you have a child, yes, I think there is some worth of owning some property so you can give it to your child, even
Right.
if their property's value is going to be downgraded by whatever, system. So even if
Right.
you buy a home for 200,000 and they downgrade it down to 50,000, at least that's $50,000 that your child will have. So
Right.
I think there's something of merit to doing that. And if you want to donate the house to a nonprofit or what I mean, I think all of that is okay. I think that's that's something that's noble, right? But this notion that you can buy the block or some type of way in which real estate can somehow provide so-called freedom is completely false, because on one hand, we see how city planning will shift its definitions and classifications of different neighborhoods as they see fit. And then they'll force evictions and other things in a number of different ways. I mean, the city of Chicago, before the Olympic bid, they were raising the utility bills in certain parts of the city that they wanted to construct some of the Olympic buildings just to get like people on fixed income out of their home. So a senior who worked, for some place and was living off of retirement, so a fixed income, they couldn't afford some type of 300% increase in their water bill or their power bill. And so they would move, they had to move. And so this will be done. So on one hand, you have those forces that will do whatever, so you can't get around that. And on the other end, if you become part of that force, you're not going to do anything of benefit. So meaning that if you want to, if we want to have wealth removes us from who we think we're associated with and puts us in contact with someone else. And so I know we talked about the state in this regard, but we haven't really talked about defining the state and what we mean by the state, or at least what I mean by the state, is it's not government. The state is not synonymous with government. The state is a production of an elite class of people trying to maintain their rule. And so they create a thing called the state to maintain that rule. And the state then is comprised of institutions of government, education, healthcare, religion, and so forth. And so everything out of those bodies then influence how we think, how we move, how we operate, and where we are then placed throughout society. So if we become laborers, we're going to do one type of role. If we're going to be managers, we're going to play another type of role. If we're upper level executives, we're going to play another type of role. But the higher we go, we're now a part of the state. And no one gets promoted to high levels if they're not going to be loyal to the state. No one. No one. Whatsoever. We have no example of anyone that has gone up that has somehow been true
beside the door or whatever. That's the movie.
There's not one historical example. This is why when people make the arguments of some person who is Black that has millions of dollars, how come they don't change the pipes in Flint or wherever else? Because they're now part of the state. It has nothing to do with, they're sellouts or whatever else. They're part of the state. Like, you are not, who you are, what you represent, how you got there, and all that type of stuff is, makes you now a part of it, because your tastes, your aspirations, your friends, everything now becomes a part of that group that you're now in. You live in a certain neighborhood area, right? For your protection. Because if you still had $100 million and you still lived on the south side of Chicago, on the west or east side of Indianapolis, East St. Louis, you may not keep that $100 million of your life.
And I don't think you should be able to.
And we see that in other cities, right? I mean, if we go in other countries, so if we go to places like Brazil, people like that, I mean, you rarely can walk in these cities in Brazil, in the neighborhood areas, not the favelas, in the neighborhood areas, and not find, you'll never see a yard. Every house has a wall with a sort of, armed gate in it, and you drive through the gate and there's concrete in the front where you park your cars or whatever else, every house. So the idea of a yard, front or back, doesn't exist for a lot of cities and a lot of other countries, because people who have money have to be safe behind those walls, and those walls have cameras, barbed wires. Sometimes they have, paid security, and so forth, because, being wide open, somebody's going to come after you or your money.
Right. So you're not, I don't know. I'm trying my best to not shit on the whole Black wealth conversation, because I know some good people involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also don't want to talk against. I understand people gonna buy homes. Like, ain't nobody saying don't get a house or nothing, right?
Right.
But there is something to be said on a broader scale about this whole like wealth building thing. It assumes that we can all just like have wealth and be left alone or something. And as we see, the whole nature of this is extraction, and somebody gets fucked over, for you to get your quote unquote wealth. So even if somehow hypothetically America was like reparations, Black people can become majority petty bourgeois, which I don't think is ever going to happen, but I'm saying even if that was like a change in plans, you're still, again, we are understanding this across the globe and not just locally, this or nationally. That's why I don't like talking about it as just discrimination. Like that wealth is still being extracted from somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you want to live in a nice house, just say you want to live in a nice house. Who wants to live in a house that has a dirt floor? Nobody, right? So you just want to live. But living in a nice house is not liberation, right? And so let's not frame it in that regards.
Right.
Because you can't buy. I mean, I know they say it all the time. You can't buy your freedom, but once you see the structure like this, there's no buying a home that sort of breaks this up. When we have these practices that have segregated and concentrated populations since the late 1400s in all states, And
you're gonna buy a home and get free.
I mean, people and we have people back then who were free Black people who bought homes, and they either bought homes and they no longer connected to the other free Black population or the enslaved population, or they were displaced from that home that they bought, right? And this is in both in imperial cities as well as in colonial cities. I mean, because Spanish Empire evolved in terms of how they managed enslavement, and so eventually people could buy themselves out of slavery, and they bought homes and stuff like that. And so you had multiple types of populations that were Black or indigenous in these cities that were either enslaved or free.
So so like buying homes, owning businesses, building this generation, what do you call it, Black wealth or whatever, building this wealth, it still doesn't pull you out of those systems.
No. It actually integrates you into them systems.
It integrates you in there more. More.
Like Rasul said, you become part of the state. Like the more you go up, you actually are separating yourself from a community. But again, I think the point I'm writing something about this kind of too. Like the point to emphasize, this isn't just some moral judgment, and I think I get tired of it whenever you bring this up. Like, you telling me I can't have a home, or you telling me I can't
buy your home, buy your cars, whatever you want to do. Nobody's mad at you for that.
Yeah. I mean, you just like whatever. You like nice stuff or whatever. If that's your definition of nice, then that's what you like. I mean, it's good. You don't have to frame it in some other particular type of way. But if you want to control your destiny, buying it is not going to happen. Clearly, right? Because what you're up against is a legacy of control.
And I guess that's part of why we wanted to do this, because it was just like when I was reading the book that stood out, and when you had told me about it, because it's just like a lot of the stuff that does give us a glimpse into the bigger picture gets moved to some narrowed down conversation like the black wealth thing, or just racial discrimination, or it's just the United States, or it's just the New Deal, and it gets so something that should like give us a big picture, like we talked about for the last 2 hours, like, oh, maps and what that like I said, we don't even think about it because we just think about like, oh, I'm not allowed to be a part of the American dream or something, that completely truncates any real imagination of actual freedom, right? Like you can't, because you're just thinking about like, I'm not included. And now it gets wrapped up in all this like radical language. I put radical in air quotes, about we got to have black wealth. And if we got black wealth, we can control our neighborhoods. And it's just like, considering how this works, you're not controlling your neighborhood just because people got homes.
No,
And like you said, the interest of having a home, usually, and this is how, when we talk about stuff like the crime bill and stuff like that, or even the war on drugs, and it gets pushed as this idea, as this attack on black people. But the reason there was a lot of co-signment among certain groups of black folks was because of property rights.
That's right.
It was because certain black people wanted to protect their property. It wasn't just that they were worried about crime hurting them. People who lived adjacent to some of these neighborhoods did want to protect their property rights, and too much crime hurts it. So send these people to jail or send them to prison.
Yeah. So one of the greatest things that the state created was private property, the concept of private property, right? So instead of having public property or the commons or whatever else, you create private property in which now that can have various amounts of value, different things can be constructed on it. You can put people on it, and they can work for you.
You can leverage it. You can get loans off of that. Yeah,
exactly. But having private property then cultivated a culture of protection of that private property. And so that's where you get law enforcement, and the main role and function of then law enforcement then turns into the protection of property, private property ownership, right? And that becomes, just the way of the land. And this is why we see in, surveys of, populations that favor certain types of policing, changes with property ownership and income value across, so-called racialized, populations, right? Because you have your property, you want to protect it at all costs. Private property then becomes more important than people. And so exactly.
And like you said, that logic gets reproduced in that class. Like, it's obvious in that case. But go ahead, Terrell.
No, so that's like me just taking a stroll through Fisher's, me being me, how I look, how I dress, whatever. I'm not being policed just because, I might be a threat, but because my presence can even drop the property value down in here.
Yeah.
That's right. And so we have to do social control mechanisms like scare you from coming back. And that's
because I come from a certain, what did we say earlier, a certain space.
That's right. And so so police stops become social control. Even whether you send these people in jail or not, you're going to create a chilling effect. There's certain places I can't walk. There's certain places I can't visit. Because it's protecting the value of their property.
Yeah. And that logic expands beyond race. There is no racial solidarity in private property.
No. Like I always argue, the state has a diversity program. So, that might not have been the case in the 1800s, but now, it's like, who cares, right? As long as you have, the same tastes and perspectives, you're cool, you're in. And that is the sort of name of the game. But this is also why, I think the whole focus on private property is why, and looking at all these maps and so on, which is why I stopped using the term gentrification, just because it doesn't explain what's actually happening, in my opinion, So I just refuse.
Why so? We'll make that the last because we already capped 2 hours, but why so? But why so?
So gentrification is just city planning.
Mm.
It had, because all of these things aren't, none of these are hidden diabolical practices. The crime map, vice map, poverty maps. None of these things were there. They were just out in front. With
it's just happenstance that it happened that it's people that look like me, or it's like I said, happenstance that people that look like me or the people that moving in, typically that have the wealth are, younger white people that, they see the property like, oh, okay, I can live there for 3 years and then, property value is going to go up. I sell it, go back to where I came from with the profits.
Yeah. But the same practices though are happening in Hong Kong.
Right.
Everywhere.
In Berlin, they're happening in Cairo. So it's like, and I think that's one part of what's unfortunate about our present era is we don't have a sense of internationalism. So we don't see how these things are literally everywhere. And once we see that they're everywhere, we can then see that there's a logic to how they function that's beyond just simple sort of reaction to a population. It's serving a purpose. It has another aim that's greater than what's being sort of done. And so I know that there's other maps that have been produced by people who try to push back on this. So I know I started with the whole sense that everyday people don't produce maps, but there are populations that have, formed together and created organizations that tried to come up with counter mapping like around, mapping eviction so that then we can collectively respond to eviction because we can sort of see where the locations of forced evictions are happening and the volume of it, because the people who are evicted think that they're on their own, right? It's just them on their block. But if they don't realize, once they see the map and they see multiple homes experiencing it, they can form a coalition. So there's plenty of groups that are around that. I know the Debt Collective does some stuff around eviction and eviction mapping. There's the statistical atlas map that anyone can look up, and they can go all the way down to a ward or district in every city to look at the demographics within every particular city in the United States. There's the Opportunity Atlas that does the same thing, but looks at like education levels and stuff like that. There's the racial dot maps that do the work of, some people have seen it where there's these color-coded sort of dots that represent where different racial categories are located throughout the city and how there's distinctive neighborhood areas. That was out of the work of people in University of Virginia. I think it was the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service in Virginia. And then, but I think there's always these other ways that we get caught up in thinking otherwise, like the Gall-Peters projection map that many of us started to praise back in maybe the late 80s, 90s, where it shows the true size of the continent. And even
I remember that. Yeah.
And even flips it upside down,
because the Nile flows south
Yeah.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that's fine to show like the real size of continents and they, how they reorient north and south. I think that's completely fine, but I think they're distractions because they don't show true power over any of the material relations and material conditions of people in these particular spaces. With that type of mapping. Maybe it's great for our personal sort of sense of ourselves, but it doesn't sort of tell us what we have to truly respond to. But we have to understand how dispossession and extraction works through these maps since the very beginning.
Yeah, thank you for that. I never thought I'd be so interested in maps. But
yeah, even and I don't know, like we were discussing it earlier about like even in the creation of these maps, we can create them and use them for good or just to identify, certain things happening or, that these clusters are forming here, there, or elsewhere. And I still think we got to make the point of like, even in creating these maps for good or whatever purpose we have, the opposite is going to happen. Some people are going to have nefarious reasons for, wanting to see these maps, wanting to look at them. And I don't know, maybe that's what worried me a little bit, because I'm like, okay, well, I get it. They're forming these maps to, kind of address these issues. But in that same respect, like when we were discussing insurance and the algorithm episode, like the insurance companies will look at maps like these and be like, okay, well then I know I can sell my same kind of insurance to these people for a higher price than from over there, just off of this map that shows that, people in poor neighborhoods tend to, have more violence, more car break-ins, more car stolen and stuff like that. And
if it's more data, then there's always, I mean, information is its own form of capital, so if it's more data, there's always an opportunity to flip it. I mean, the atomic bomb was based on equations that, and it got turned into an atomic bomb. That wasn't initially the goal, you know. So information can be used. It's information itself is neutral, but it always is open to be exploited. That's why things can be co-opted. People think that there's a one way that things point, and it's rarely ever that, it's rarely that anything points one way and it's always going to stay pointed that way. Even if it started pointed in whatever way you thought it should be, it can always be angled somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially if you're going up against a state.
No, absolutely. And I have to just give, some final acknowledgments. Again, Daniel Nimsa's Infrastructure's a Race, highly recommend for people, but even if they don't get it, I just feel the need to sort of say how invaluable that piece of work was in terms of my own work. And then Laura Vaughn's The Mapping of Society, or The Mapping Society, I think that's the title of the book. And she does a better job of talking about these maps than what I've done, because that's all she does in this particular book is talk about the history of these maps and the implications of these maps. And she also has, I think, a database of these maps, for people to look at.
And people can get your book where also.
Yeah,
I was about to do that. Like, make sure shout out to do
it. So through Routledge. The book is called The Geographies of Threat and Production of Violence, the State and City Between Us.
Cool. We'll also have a link in the description where you can get the book. Nice picture of it will be posted.
Yep. You can find it in the show notes. So we might get lucky and break this down into 4 episodes if we keep talking like this. But you can find this. You can find the book in the show notes. But I've had a chance to read the book. It's what we talked about today is primarily just chapter 2. so like it's a dense book where you gotta really appreciate, like, he put in work. I know you don't want me to gas him up, but like he really put in work. Like, it's a lot of information to really set with. I mean, I've even heard you say, Rasul, is in another interview, it's probably something you should read in moments. You don't have to read it all at once. This whole like thing on the internet where everybody wants to prove how many books they can read. Like, the point is to use the information to actually do something, not to just say you read it. Because I had to read it faster than I wanted to, and I actually want to read it slower. So yeah, but it's definitely a good book. I would definitely check it out. We don't talk enough about space and geography beyond, like we said, these kind of like confined conversations about gentrification and redlining that usually just get watered down to the discrimination or whatever.
I think that's an important point. Just, I guess, just another final closing. I mean, I think I really want to acknowledge, people who just thought completely out of the box. The Republic of New Africa thought spatially about Black liberation, and not just thinking about the 5 states in the South, but thinking of ways in which to link Jamaica and Belize and Trinidad and so on as a part of those 5 states. Did they, succeed in any particular way? No, but they dared, right? And I think also, just in terms of traditional politicians, the creation of Soul City, North Carolina, when people want to talk about buying the block, they're never going to talk about buying the block on that level where they created a new city, and you know, out of nowhere. There was no Soul City in this location, but they constructed it. It still stands today. It's not successful financially where they thought it would be. They wanted to create a model city where people across racial categories and economic classes can create a sort of social system of support and so on. But they dared, right, you know, to create something that, you know, wasn't existing before.
And these things are worth considering. You know, I'm not saying it's, you know, like you said, a lot of these things haven't been as successful as they planned. And I'm not saying it's the sole solution either. I mean, some of the solutions can't even be discussed on a Zoom call. But I'm just saying, like, these things are worth thinking outside of the box in ways and trying to construct different spaces. And when I say that, I don't mean just like safe spaces or whatever that means. I'm saying like actual physical spaces that have different relationships beyond the way that, you know, the state gives. It's worth considering what that looks like. If we want to move beyond this idea of the state in the first place, we have to consider what that looks like. Otherwise, we'll just continue to go until climate change destroys us or something, you know. So yeah, thanks for being on here. We appreciate it.
Definitely.
Have no clue how I'm gonna break this down just yet, but yeah, thanks for being on here. And appreciate everybody for listening. And tune in. We'll be discussing another myth with Rasul about the myth being that violence or racial violence is equal to hate, which, you know, that's not a thing. So we're going to be dealing with, just like we talked today about, there's more intricacy in mapping and space beyond it just being something you use to get from one place to another. Violence is more, or racial violence is more than just hating somebody or beating them up. And just like redlining, I think Rasul made the point, just like redlining is talked about like the worst form of segregation. Lynching gets talked about as the worst type of racial violence. And we're going to talk about it. That's really not the case. So tune in for that. Appreciate everybody. Peace out.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was